Good morning. Tanshi kia matin. Kia wao. How is everybody doing? You have to have some more gumption than that, people. Forgive my reading glasses, but like my sister Candy, some of my bits are starting to fail. So I want to say good morning, bon matin, good morning. And I want to acknowledge that we are on Anishinaabeg and Métis territory, and specifically Garden River and Batchewana Ojibwe communities, as well as the historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis. I also want to acknowledge the special significance of the site that we are on today, the former Shingwak School, Indian Residential School. And I want to acknowledge the children of the Shingwak alumni, the survivors, all the work that they have done, and especially think about the children that are actually buried here in this cemetery. I want to thank Elder Edna for lighting the kuluk yesterday and to wish her a belated happy birthday, as well as Elder Shirley, the chancellor here at Shingwak. I'd like to thank President Delia and Ozma and all of the people that have put so much work into organizing this forum, the universities that have ensured that this is now in its 5th year that this kind of a forum exists. I want to acknowledge our leadership that are here in the room today, our regional councillor, Ernie Gatien, happy birthday, Ernie, and our president of our youth council, Mitch Case, who actually works here at Shingwak. He's not able to be with us this morning. He's off to ceremony. But I also want to acknowledge the chair of our historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis Council, Steve Joss, who is here in the room with us. And I think it's important that we acknowledge our leadership and our community members for the work that they do. And in fact, I want to acknowledge all of our elders that are here. I want to acknowledge our veterans, and I think that's also very important for us to do every time we gather. And in particular, our youth and our LGBTQ and two-spirited community members, all those people that make up our communities and the blessings that they bring to us. And I'm really happy to see the voices of young people being reflected in this forum consistently throughout, and I think that is really important. So I'm happy to see that. I have a presentation, and I'm going to go through this very quickly with you. So this is going to be sort of a Métis 101 at about 100 kilometers an hour. I don't have a lot of time with you today, so we're going to talk about a lot of stuff, but fundamentally, reconciliation starts with truth. And that's why when Canada established that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, truth comes first. We need to fully understand these things before we can really understand and consider how do we address reconciliation. We need to understand and tell our history, our stories, before we can begin talking about reconciliation. And fundamentally, this concept of working together to advance healing and reconciliation within our institutions is going to involve education, and it's going to require action. And so I'm going to be speaking briefly this morning about who the Métis are, also who are not, our emergence as a distinct people, which is why we are recognized as an Indigenous people or an Aboriginal peoples of Canada, that concept of Otipemisiwak, this notion of the people who govern themselves, and how we are moving forward with governing ourselves today. And fundamentally, our story as Métis people truly is one about respect. It's about our rights. It's about our commitment to resilience, our commitment to resistance, and it's fundamentally about our resilience as a people in spite of all of the roadblocks, all of the challenges that have been placed in front of us over the course of our journey. And I hadn't realized that it was menopause that required me to drink so much water. So thank you, Candy, for that further education. So some of the fundamentals. When we think about the history of this country and the emergence of the Métis as a people, we have to be mindful of the geography and what it meant. And fundamentally, in the very early days of Canada being Canada, there was a corridor that was highly organized early on in Canada's history, but there was a whole swath of land that was referred historically as the Old Northwest that was in those early days protected against settlement, so that basically the countries overseas could really pull out our resources in terms of the fur trade in this country. And as such, this large territory was protected against settlement. And the reality was that the people on the land during the course of that time, over the course of many, many decades, were First Nations, in the northern communities, the Inuit, and those Europeans that came over to work within the fur trade. And over the course of several generations, with the mixing of European fur traders, people working in the fur trade, and First Nation communities, there was the opportunity, basically an opportunity to incubate the creation of, in effect, a new people. And that is who we are as Métis people. So over the course of generations, people that were of mixed First Nations and European ancestry started to seek each other out. There was, through the process of endogamy, marrying people that are like yourself, creation of communities. We got to a point where there was a creation of a distinct identity of Métis people or half-breeds. There are many other terms that were used to refer to us, but a distinct people, a distinct community, a distinct language, the language of Michif, many different dialects, but the language that unites, and a unique history and culture. And it was because of that emergence of these distinct Métis communities, separate from their First Nations relatives, separate from their European relatives, that it was those distinct communities which led to this process of what's called ethnogenesis, or the creation of a new people. And so as Métis, we exist as a people here in this country just for the last couple of hundred years. And so we have a very unique story to tell, and really fundamentally, it comes out of understanding the fur trade and its history on this land. And here's a map of some of the fur trade routes, and when you think about where our communities are located today here in Ontario, just as an example, it very much mirrors our people stuck around those fur trade routes and those fur trade posts. But again, the opportunity to come together as communities, and because of the work of the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, which were the employers of Métis people in the day, there was constant movement back and forth. So we are, and we continue to this day, to be an incredibly mobile people. We also know that while there was a lot of east-west movement in the early days of the fur trade, after the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged in 1820, that some of that east-west constant movement was cut off. And so the story here in Ontario is one where there's, out on the prairies, there's that buffalo hunting focused Métis community. Here in Ontario, those communities really focused around the Great Lakes. And in fact, there was formation of these larger historic Métis communities in Ontario. And our story is about that distinct identity, that language, the culture, the traditions. And I think fundamentally you have to understand that Métis are not simply a people of mixed First Nation and European ancestry. And I think Candy mentioned that this morning, going to school and having those kids look at her and call her a half-breed out of a misunderstanding and ignorance, right, out of racism. That term half-breed is something that some of our people are starting to reclaim today and to try and use it in a more empowering way. But ultimately, it's not, when we talk about half-breeds, when we talk about breeds, we are talking about animals, and this is why so many of us find it fundamentally a very offensive term. But we as Métis people today are descendants of those distinct Métis communities that formed around the Great Lakes in Ontario, out across the prairies, up into the Northwest Territories, over into some parts of northeastern British Columbia, and down into the northern parts of the United States. When we talk about Métis, that is who we are talking about, people that are descendants of those distinct Métis communities. And so that's a starting point for us today in our conversation. In terms of an emergence of a national identity, there were events in our history, and again, coming back to that notion of rights, standing up for our rights, and our fellow relatives, our First Nation rights as well, active resistance, and ultimately our resilience as a people. And one of the incidents that has led to a recognition of a national identity is what was referred to in 1816 as the Battle of Seven Oaks, what we refer to as the Victory of Frog Plain, where a very young, and that's the history, when you look at Métis history, those leaders that were stepping forward, whether it's Cuthbert Grant or Louis Riel, we're talking about young people that were in their fairly early 20s, stepping forward and standing up against the forces of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Selkirk settlers at the tail end of what was referred to as the Pemmican Wars. Our people were very much involved in in trade, in the fur trade, and then in other trades, things like pemmican and others. So that battle in 1816 marked the very first time that Métis people came together under one flag, this is the flag of the Métis Nation. It's the oldest flag in Canada, being in existence since 1816. But it really led to this recognition of the creation of a national identity. And again, that story of resistance, it's a fundamental component or aspect of who we are as Métis people. And we are a people that speak up. I think that if any of you know Métis people, you know that we use our voices, and we use them very effectively. We use our voice to argue for justice. And there is a long history of Métis petitions. I've listed some of these here, thanks to the work, I would say, and I have to acknowledge Larry Barkwell, who's a historian who just recently passed away. But Laurie has done so much work writing about the history of Métis people. But Métis petitions, there is this long history, starting with the Penetanguishene petition in 1840 in the Georgian Bay area here in Ontario, but carrying through from Red River right here in Sault Ste. Marie. But you see this, as you look at the dates, you can start to see and imagine then this history with the push of settlement from Ontario westward. You start to see these petitions coming from Métis communities saying, we are here on this land with our First Nation relatives, and we, in many cases, and in some cases actually the majority of the people on the land being Métis, but we are here on the land and we demand that you recognize our rights to this land. And so that's that history of petitions. And for First Nations also wrote petitions, and in fact in some of these, for example, the 1850 petition from the Métis community here in Sault Ste. Marie, there was a sister petition from First Nation leadership here in the Sault Ste. Marie area to also argue for respect for Métis ownership of land, right here where we're talking about in Sault Ste. Marie. For First Nations, this act of resistance led to treaties for the most part, First Nations being pushed onto reserves, the diminishment of the access and the recognition of access to lands. For Métis, with one exception, this led to an exclusion from the treaty process, a refusal to treat with the Métis, and a dispossession of lands. And for First Nations and Métis and for Inuit, it led to colonialist policies here in Canada, things like the Indian Act, things like the Indian residential schools, things like 60 Scoop, and so on. But right here, this story of resistance, I just want to take a moment to talk to you briefly about the significance of where we are right now and this historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis community. There was, as there was movement to start to actually survey and carve up the land here, right here in downtown Sault Ste. Marie, the Métis and the First Nations pushed back. And in fact, it led to, with the push of resource development into this region, it led to in 1849 something called the Mica Bay Incident, where Métis and First Nation leaders decided that this was enough and they were going to actually, again, active resistance, they were going to come together and actually shut down a copper mine. They also managed to borrow a cannon, which got a fair amount of attention. And we know how to do that. We know how to get that attention. And that led ultimately to a fellow by the name of Robinson being sent out to this territory to negotiate treaties with First Nations. First Nation leaders and Métis leaders said to Robinson, you need to deal with Métis as well. First Nations said, those are our relatives. You need to deal with Métis as well. And ultimately Robinson said, I don't have a mandate to treat with the Métis, but trust us. Trust me, we will come back and we will enter into treaty with the Métis. And I like to tell the historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis community they're a very patient people, because that was in 1850 and the Crown never showed up again. And in fact, the promises to protect lands here in Sault Ste. Marie, because the Métis held lands right here in downtown Sault Ste. Marie in the same river lot land tenure that Métis have employed in Red River, in Alberta, and across the Métis homeland. Robinson promised to protect those lands. And in fact, the very exact opposite happened. There was speculation. And over the course of a decade, a very vibrant Métis village, Métis community here in Sault Ste. Marie was reduced to just a handful of families. And for those Métis people, like with Métis all across the homeland, as settlement came and Métis pushed back and were told, we won't treat with you, Métis were pushed off their lands. Some went on to neighboring reserves with relatives but created their own villages on those reserves. Some went off onto Crown land. And like with so many other Métis communities, eventually Ontario showed up and actually pushed those Métis off of those lands, burned down their village, and again dispossessed the Métis. And this story of dispossession is one that I think will resonate with Indigenous people all across Canada. So that story of resistance, 1849, that Mica Bay Incident, the petitions, the treaty and the petitions from Métis and First Nations in 1850 to say, you have to protect and respect Métis land interests, which went unanswered. That's 1849. So as that push continues across Canada, you see in 1869, Métis forming a local government in 1869, which led to the Ottawa, John A. Macdonald not being very happy with this, sending out troops, thousands of troops out to Winnipeg. And Louis Riel and the Provisional Council that he formed were successful in the meantime in actually negotiating the creation of Manitoba. He negotiated the establishment of Manitoba as a province and so, only recently being recognized as a father of confederation. But those troops still came, and over the course, so that was 1870, over the course of the next couple of years, this was a time period in that Red River community that was recognized and referred to as the Reign of Terror, where these soldiers that came from Eastern Canada were raping Métis women, were killing people, there were lynchings, and it was a time of great turmoil and violence against our communities. So that's 1869, 1870. You see in 1875, again, petitions and arguments around Métis interests in the area of Treaty 3. And this is the one, as I said before, the one example where Métis they actually entered into treaty as Métis people. The only example in Canada is the half-breed adhesion to Treaty 3 in 1875. And so that we surmise that the negotiators went back to Ottawa and were basically smacked upside the head and said, why on earth would you ever treat with Métis people? It never happened again. So we see this push, the continued push that led to the Northwest resistance and the battles at Duck Lake, Fish Creek, Cut Knife, and then finally Batoche, something that I'm hoping that everyone in this room is aware of. We haven't done a good job of educating people about the history of Métis people. But again, as the push of settlement comes, and you heard that story in Red River, and again in Batoche, the push as settlement comes, the resistance back by the Métis people, and in this case, armed resistance, which ultimately led to the Battle of Batoche. It led to our leader, Louis Riel, giving himself up in order to make a stand on these issues, being found guilty of treason and hanged in Regina in November of 1885. Finally recognized as a father of confederation just recently, actually. But following that, the killing of Louis Riel, there was this period in our history referred to as Le Grand Silence. And we have that story. The stories of the violence done against our ancestors is still very much alive and well, and I think has had a real impact in our communities and our families, that intergenerational trauma, and there's certainly that's part of our story. So while there was this effort to move to enter into treaties and push First Nations onto reserve, on the prairies there was this program that referred to as SCRIP, which was said to be about recognizing Métis interests in land, but really was another land speculation situation where Métis were again dispossessed of their lands, and that's part of my family's history too. And ultimately, again, being pushed off lands, we were in particular in the West, we came to be known as the road allowance people because we would be pushed into lands that were set aside. Those lands along the roadways were the only pieces of land where we could find to settle and to create communities. And again, continually being pushed. So there's this transient, there's this dispossession story that is fundamental to our history. There was a lot of work coming back from that. And finally, thanks to the leadership of our past leaders, in 1982, with the negotiation of Canada's Constitution, the Métis were finally recognized as one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada under Section 35. So that was in 1982, but it took until 2003 before what Métis rights under Section 35 actually meant came from that Supreme Court of Canada decision in the Powley decision. And it was Steve and his son Roddy Powley, right here in Sault Ste. Marie, that brought that fight forward with the support of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And in fact, we're just about to celebrate next month. On November 19th, we'll be celebrating the hanging of Louis Riel. We've just celebrated Powley Day on September 19th, the anniversary of the decision coming down. This was the watershed decision for Métis rights in Canada, and it remains the test for proving Métis rights under Section 35 in this country, and that's very much due to the leadership of the community here, the Powleys, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. We've built on that victory in Powley. You might have heard about the Manitoba Métis Land Claims case that came out in that Supreme Court decision in 2013 on the Manitoba Métis Federation, and that was all about recognized a land claim for Métis in there based on those promises when Manitoba was negotiated, the promises to give land to Métis communities. That was never fulfilled. And we also have, pulling from that, and that the decision, the Supreme Court talked about, we have to reconcile these grievances of Métis in Canada if we are ever going to achieve reconciliation, and referred to it actually as a matter of national and constitutional import. And if there's one thing that you're going to write down today, and you're going to go online later today and find a link to, it's a report from a fellow by the name of Tom Isaac, who is a special representative to the Government of Canada on how to move forward on reconciliation with regard to Métis in Canada. It's a very easy read, but it'll give you a sense of our history, why we are recognized as having those Section 35 rights, and a series of recommendations to Canada and to the provinces on how to move forward with reconciliation. And I would challenge you to consider those recommendations as to how they might apply to your institutions as well. In 2016, we finally resolved the question of jurisdiction with the Daniels decision, and this decision was all about this political football, hot potato. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for the Métis. In the 1930s, the Inuit took a case forward to the Supreme Court of Canada and got recognition that Inuit as well as First Nations fell under federal jurisdiction. It wasn't until 2016 that it was finally recognized that there was a responsibility with regard to the Métis as well. The Métis Nation of Ontario, which is one of 5 Métis governments that make up the Métis National Council, and I am the president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, is guided by our Statement of Prime Purpose. We have a great website, and there's a lot of information there for you, but our Statement of Prime Purpose sets out our values and our principles, and it talks about our goals and objectives, and a fundamental part of that is to advance Métis rights, Métis right of self-determination and self-government in Canada. Our communities, as I mentioned before, you saw the map of those historic fur trade routes. You can see some consistency there. Our communities have continued to remain on the lands of their ancestors, as well as some of these southern areas where our people have come to live and work. And so we provide programs and services in those areas. And we've done a great deal of work. This is a slide where we actually pulled some information for LINZ in Ontario to understand the percentage of the local Aboriginal population that was Métis. It was a real eye-opener for the leaders in Ontario's health services. So we've done an enormous amount of work in terms of identifying historic Métis communities in Ontario, and we did this in partnership with Ontario. Rather than litigate, which we will do if we have to, we thought it made sense to actually come together, look at the history, and our case lands or falls on the facts of history. I'm very happy to say that after having made great progress over the last 4 years with the current federal government, that in June of this year, the Métis Nation of Ontario, along with the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, signed very historic self-government agreements with the Government of Canada, recognizing our community's inherent right of self-determination and self-government. And that recognition is something that we will continue to build on. But one of the key areas that we've identified in our conversations with Canada is in the area of education. That's an area where we will move forward looking at negotiating jurisdiction in those future talks. And I'm also very happy to say that along with the four other Métis governments, last June we signed an accord with regard to post-secondary education. And finally, for the first time in our history, Canada has made a commitment to supporting Métis post-secondary education in Canada. And that comes with a commitment of $362 million over the next decade to support Métis students in post-secondary. We're going to be working with our students, and we're going to be working with institutions like yours to ensure that universities and colleges are actively working to advance healing and reconciliation, in particular that in ways that address the needs of our Métis students. And we are going to be using our financial commitment to ensure and hold universities and responsibles accountable to that. I mentioned earlier all those colonial policies and the impacts on us. Métis were impacted by residential schools. We're absolutely impacted by the ongoing story of violence against our women and our girls. And yet Métis experiences have actually not been addressed through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Women. There is so much more of the story of our experiences, Métis people, that still needs to be told. There is so much work that needs to be done. And as I said at the start of my presentation, before we can really talk about reconciliation, we have to get to the truth and hear those stories. So I was reflecting on what it is that you can and should be doing as an individual, but also as an institution. And one of the things, and I had a good conversation with Candy before she left. She's an old friend of mine, so thank you, organizers, for putting us both on the agenda for today. That was helpful. One of the things that you need to be mindful of is a movement of self-indigenization by some people in this country, particularly in Eastern Canada, who have drawn back and claimed some long ago First Nation ancestor and therefore are claiming Métis status or identity in this country. And this is a growing phenomena, particularly after the Corbière decision, after the Powley and Daniels decision. You need to educate yourself and your institutions on who the Métis are. You need to understand our history. You need to connect with our Métis governments. And you need to know and ensure that you are not, through ignorance, supporting this movement of self-indigenization by recognizing these organizations. This is very important. These groups are undermining First Nation rights. This is the reason that they are being formed, is through the research. And if you want to learn more about this movement, follow an academic by the name of Daryl LaRue, who is shining a very bright light on this very offensive problem of self-indigenization. It's undermining First Nation rights, and it's deeply offensive to the Métis. So know who we are. This is important. Make sure that you're making space for Métis within your institution. And that's understanding the importance of our language and the language that we use. For example, when we use pan-Aboriginal or pan-Indigenous language, that oftentimes renders Métis invisible. It's important to actually use our names, to refer to Métis, to refer to Inuit, to refer to First Nations. And in fact, if you can be specific about the nations that you're referring to, use that language too, because it identifies and recognizes and shows respect. So make space for Métis culture, our history. Don't underestimate the importance of ensuring the representation of Métis symbols within your institution and understanding all of that history and culture and ensuring that's reflected through your curriculum. And ensure that what is being reflected is authentic. That's very important. Ensure that in doing that, in creating those programs, the curricula, that you are making space for programs and services that allow us to connect to the land and to the waters. That's fundamental, our language and our culture. Make sure that you have a distinctions-based approach, as I said, that respects who we are as Métis, as distinct from First Nations, as distinct from Inuit. You can't apply the same approach, the same solutions, the same understandings to all of our communities because we are distinct and we are different. Connect with our Métis governments, the Métis Nation of Ontario, the Manitoba Métis Federation, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the Métis Nation of Alberta, and the Métis Nation of British Columbia. We can help you understand who we are as Métis. We can help you understand our history. We can help you understand our language and culture and ensure that what you are doing in your efforts to advance reconciliation is authentic. We can be resources to you and to your institutions. And in doing all of these things, you are going to help ensure that you are supporting our students. We have built our own supports because of a complete lack of supports for Métis, for example, here in Ontario, through something called our Infinite Reach program, where we have Métis students in 42 universities and colleges around Ontario that are there to connect with other Métis students, that are there to ensure that there are opportunities for celebrating our culture, that are there to help build community and a sense of belonging and respect for Métis students. It's an amazing program that you should think about for your institution. We respect and engage our youth. They're helping to lead the way in revitalizing our history and our culture as Métis people. And I just want to reflect in closing on some of the comments that have been made that really hit me. Elder Edna, when she was lighting the kuluk, was talking about how it takes time and patience to light the kuluk. You have to be persistent, but eventually, if you keep at it, the flame goes right across the kuluk and it lights the way. It provides that sustenance and that support. And I think about the words that Paul Davidson shared that reminded us about the very beautiful Murray Sinclair in his closing remarks as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that it was education that got us into this mess, it'll be education that gets us out, but also stressing that unlearning is going to be hard, but it's necessary. And I want to ask you to think about what you have been taught about the Métis, and then do that unlearning and re-educate yourself and your institution. And fundamentally, and referring back to Chief Bobby Joseph, to Candy and others, reconciliation truly does start with you. It starts with you and your understanding, but understanding that when we get, I really loved Chief Robert Joseph, when he spoke yesterday, talked about when you get that peace and light and love in your heart, that will ripple out to your family, out to your community, out to your nation. And that message that I think was delivered so strongly this morning, that we are enough and that we need to commit to continuing to do this hard work and doing it in a way that respects Métis as well as First Nations and Inuit people. So look at your institution, think about what you've done, think about the more that you can do, think about how you can reach out to our governments and our communities to support you in that work, and understand that this path of healing in advance and advancing reconciliation with Métis is work that is meaningful and it's worthwhile. And as many others have said, we can't fully achieve reconciliation until we address the Métis and all of that work, our history, so that we can really fulfill that dream of one day actually achieving reconciliation in this country. So thank you, merci, and have a wonderful and safe trip home. Merci.
Thank you very much.